Welcome to this explainer. When you hear the words Soviet economy today, what immediately pops into your head? For most of us, it's a pretty specific set of images. Chronic shortages, people standing in long lines just to buy bread, endless rows of monotonous gray buildings, and of course, its spectacular eventual collapse. But here's the thing. From an economic and historical perspective, that picture is actually significantly incomplete. Today, we're going to dive into the data and take a really serious, balanced, and academically rigorous look at what this monumental historical experiment genuinely got right. We're going to explore how a massive central state mobilized an entire society to literally build an industrial superpower from the ground up. And as you'll see, acknowledging those incredible achievements is actually the secret to accurately understanding its ultimate downfall. So this brings us to our central question for today. What did the Soviet system actually do well, and why did those strengths matter? You see, if we really want to understand the Soviet Union, we can't just dismiss it as a total failure from day one. That's too easy. Taking its genuine economic strengths seriously is exactly what helps us explain its later failures much more accurately. We really need to understand the underlying institutional logic that drove both its incredible rise and its eventual crushing stagnation. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start by moving beyond the collapse narrative. Then we'll examine full employment and growth. After that, we'll unpack the massive undertaking of the Soviet social wage. Then we'll pivot to the inherent limits of central planning, look at the institutional trade-offs, and finally, wrap up with the lessons modern economies can take away from all of this. Let's dive right in. Section 1. Beyond the collapse narrative, reevaluating the economic history. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to start by establishing an objective academic lens and kind of strip away all that lingering Cold War rhetoric. Simplistic success or failure stories completely miss the point. The Soviet economy was this massive, incredibly complex machine. To understand it, we must look at how it actually operated structurally. Unlike a capitalist system, it didn't rely on market signals or organic price discovery. Instead, it mobilized resources through strict top-down quotas and deliberate state directives. The state decided absolutely everything: what was built, where it was built, and exactly who built it. And here's the crucial takeaway. The very mechanisms that allowed it to rapidly build a superpower, coordinating resources on a scale the world had basically never seen, are the exact same mechanisms that later caused it to stagnate. You literally cannot understand the collapse without first understanding the engine that built it. Section 2. Full employment and growth, the engine of industrialization. Take a look at this stark historical contrast, because it's absolutely crucial for context. In October of 1930, the Soviet government announced the official end of unemployment. Now, to be clear, the state certainly made labor compulsory, and they tightly controlled job placements, but they fundamentally eradicated the mass open unemployment and the incredibly volatile business cycles that were absolutely devastating Western market economies at that exact same time during the Great Depression. So while breadlines absolutely existed in the USSR, that profound existential dread of mass unemployment, the kind you saw devastating families in places like Detroit or London, was structurally eliminated. The state acted as a single massive employer. And because the state could just choose to run enterprises at a loss, full employment became a guaranteed structural reality for the entire population. This leads us to a really vital economic concept: extensive growth. The Soviets achieved their breathtaking early expansion not necessarily by making individual workers incredibly efficient right out of the gate, but by mobilizing vast, sweeping amounts of previously unused labor and capital. I mean, they literally brought millions of peasants out of the fields and directly into the factories. This wasn't just some minor economic shift, it was a massive, rapid urbanization shift that fundamentally rewired the demographics of the entire country in just a matter of years. They pushed labor force participation to about 80% of working-age adults. For context, that compares to around 70% in the United States at the time. They essentially brute-forced economic expansion by throwing every single available human and material resource at the singular goal of industrialization. And the historical data paints a fascinating picture of this trajectory. According to economic historian Robert C. Allen, the proportional growth in GDP per head from 1928 to 1970 reveals a really striking reality. During this period of extensive growth, heavily driven by those rigid five-year plans, the Soviet Union's GDP growth per capita actually exceeded that of several prominent Western countries. By centrally directing all investments, they achieved staggeringly high rates of capital accumulation. The state heavily prioritized the massive expansion of heavy industry, we're talking coal, steel, electricity, over immediate consumer comfort. And the numbers totally reflect a society transforming itself at just breakneck speed. The sheer scale of this state-led development was staggering. I mean, they were building entire industrial cities from absolutely nothing. Places like Magnitogorsk in the Ural Mountains, literally rising out of the wilderness. They constructed massive factories to produce heavy machinery, built extensive public transport networks just to move this newly forged working class around, and forced a massive share of the national income directly into long-term investment. Through immense human sacrifice and sheer concentrated willpower, they transformed what was a largely agrarian, peasant society into a formidable, heavy industrial superpower in basically a single generation. Section 3. The Soviet Social Wage, Decommodifying Basic Life Chances. Now, the ideological legitimacy of the entire Soviet state rested on what we can call a massive social umbrella, a cradle-to-grave social contract written right into their constitution. By guaranteeing employment, free universal education, state-funded pensions, subsidized housing, and free healthcare, the system fundamentally reduced a citizen's dependence on private wealth. In academic terms, they effectively decommodified basic life chances. This is absolutely crucial to understand. It meant that basic survival, healthcare, and social mobility were totally untethered from your personal bank account or your family's wealth, which was a radical structural departure from capitalist systems. This welfare apparatus was enormous. Eventually, it was eating up as much as 30% of the entire national budget just to maintain these universal guarantees. And the tangible impact of their universal education policies, in particular, was profound. Rapid industrialization and eventually their pioneering achievements in space science required an absolutely massive supply of technical knowledge and engineering prowess. Just consider this statistic. In the early 1960s, 40% of all chemistry PhDs in the USSR were attained by women. In the United States at that same time, it was just 5%. The state aggressively built a vast network of educational institutions and deliberately prioritized gender equality in the scientific and technical workforce simply because they needed to maximize their labor pool to achieve their incredibly ambitious technological goals. We see a very similar massive mobilization in public health through what is known as the Samashko model. This was a completely revolutionary concept for its time, a highly centralized, entirely state-funded healthcare system. They focused heavily on preventative medicine, universal immunizations, and controlling infectious diseases at a broad population level. And it genuinely worked to drastically lower infant mortality and push life expectancy up to about 67 years by the 1960s. But, and this is a critical structural trade-off to keep in mind, it was kept cost-effective largely by paying doctors incredibly low wages. In fact, doctors, who were predominantly women in the USSR, were often paid significantly less than heavy industrial factory workers. That highlights a really unique structural quirk in exactly how the Soviet state valued different types of labor. 15 million. That's how many prefabricated apartments, widely known as Khrushchevsky, were built between 1956 and 1964. Under Nikita Khrushchev, the state launched an incredibly ambitious housing construction program to alleviate the chronic, severe housing shortages left over from rapid urbanization and, of course, the utter devastation of World War II. They moved over 100 million Soviet citizens out of cramped, miserable communal flats. The psychological impact of this honestly cannot be overstated. Moving a family from a crowded communal kitchen where multiple families literally shared a single stove into a private apartment with its own door, its own kitchen, and its own bathroom, that was a massive leap in human dignity and basic living standards for millions and millions of people. Section 4. Limits of central planning, the vicious circle of shortages. Okay, so having looked at the successes, we really must pivot to the severe limits of central planning and see how those exact same earlier strengths directly fed into systemic failures. Let's break down what economists call the vicious circle of shortages. Imagine the state orders a massive increase in tank production. Boom. This immediately sucks up all available steel in the system, which causes a completely unexpected shortage for, say, tractor factories. To fix the new tractor shortage, central planners scramble and order the rapid construction of a new steel mill. But building that mill requires more concrete, causing a critical shortage in housing construction. Because the economy was already running at absolute full capacity, planners forcing emergency investments just sparked a new cycle of shortages somewhere else. It was basically a permanent race against time that generated pervasive scarcity across the entire economy. The really crucial point here is that without the natural feedback mechanisms of market prices, the system blindly traded quality for quantity. Because factory managers were rewarded purely on hitting raw output quotas set by distant bureaucrats, bizarre inefficiencies popped up everywhere. For example, imagine a shoe factory mandated to produce a specific number of shoes. They might only produce small sizes to save on leather and hit their quota faster, completely ignoring the actual sizes real people needed to wear.
And those 15 million apartments we talked about, well, they were structurally deficient, very poorly insulated, and monotonously uniform. Consumer goods were notoriously scarce and usually of terrible quality. The state had this incredible capacity to build massive steel plants and send rockets to space, but without market flexibility, it completely failed to innovate or produce the complex, quality consumer goods its increasingly educated population actually wanted.
Section 5. The institutional trade-offs. Two sides of the same coin. This brings us to a really defining feature of the Soviet economy, the soft budget constraint. This is a vital concept coined by the economist Janos Karnai. Because the state guaranteed full employment and prioritized hitting output targets above absolutely everything else, a state enterprise could never truly go bankrupt. The state would simply always step in and bail them out. Knowing this, factory managers acted completely rationally. They hoarded materials, stockpiled equipment, and padded their employment rosters with extra workers. This wasn't malicious, right? It was a logical survival strategy in a system where supply chains were dictated by inflexible bureaucrats rather than dynamic pricing. You kept extra resources hidden just in case you suddenly needed them to hit an unexpected quota. And this dynamic perfectly reveals the ultimate trade-off of the whole Soviet system. You can't separate the good from the bad. They were literally two sides of the exact same coin. The systemic strength of guaranteed job security created the systemic weakness of chronic underemployment, what some clever observers called employed unemployment. This was the deep irony. Everyone had a guaranteed job, sure, but workers frequently sat completely idle on the factory floor for days because the plant simply lacked materials to actually build anything. The systemic strength of rapid, centrally planned heavy industrialization inherently caused the systemic weakness of a bloated bureaucracy and a devastating scarcity of consumer goods. They successfully achieved macro stability, but at the absolute devastating cost of micro-efficiency. Section 6. Lessons for modern economies. State capacity versus market flexibility. So, finally, what can modern economies actually learn from this massive historical experiment? We study the Soviet economy not to replicate it, obviously, but to rigorously understand both the absolute limits and the incredible capacities of state power. We have to acknowledge that during its early, extensive growth phase, state-led planning did successfully modernize a largely underdeveloped agrarian society. We also have to remember the context. During the mid-20th century, market systems were struggling with immense volatility and inequality, making the Soviet ability to forcefully coordinate capital accumulation look highly appealing to many developing nations. It built a massive, educated, industrial workforce faster than almost any market system could have under similar historical constraints. As economic historian Robert C. Allen summarized perfectly, the central planning of firm output, in conjunction with the soft budget constraint, was highly effective at mobilizing otherwise unemployed labor and idle resources. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a state can brute force the foundations of heavy industry and distribute a massive social wage of education and healthcare. But, and it's a huge but, once an economy matures, becomes highly complex, and requires intensive, innovation-driven growth, centralized material balancing completely breaks down. Central planning works remarkably well when the goal is simple and quantifiable, like producing millions of tons of steel or thousands of tanks. But it fails spectacularly when the economy needs to invent the microchip or rapidly respond to nuanced, changing consumer trends. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative question. The Soviet experiment showed us that a state can absolutely guarantee housing, jobs, and healthcare, but it did so through rigid mechanisms that ultimately destroyed economic efficiency and personal freedom. So, how can modern societies today balance the ambition of providing robust, guaranteed public goods while preserving the crucial market flexibility and innovation required to actually sustain them over the long haul? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive has given you a richer, more nuanced understanding of this incredibly fascinating chapter in economic history.